question comes from Sandy out of Austin, Texas, and she writes, Dr. Broggi, my husband and I were members of Community Bible Church 15 years ago in South Carolina. Here in Texas, we have been attending a Bible teaching church with faithful leadership and believers. Recently, while going through the book of 1 Corinthians, we studied whether or not women's head coverings is still a mandate for the church today. After a 3-week study, it has been concluded that a head covering is still for women in the church. As you can imagine, now we have veiled and unveiled. Some have left altogether, and it has become a little uncomfortable. Headship is clear in the Bible, both at home and in church. However, I do not feel I need to wear a head veil, nor does my husband want me to wear one. We have family members who act like they're in a cult and follow this tradition, so it makes me uncomfortable to do the same. We were told the burden of proof to the contrary is on us to demonstrate that it is no longer needed for today. Is this a mandate for Christian women today? If not, why was it solely for the early church if the tradition only ceased in the 20th century? Thank you.
All right, so this is a great question, and as you read certain passages of Scripture, there are some things that are timeless in terms of the principles and the applications that are taught, while at the same time having cultural expressions. For instance, and I'll illustrate with this, and then we'll talk about head coverings. If you remember in John chapter 13, they are at the Lord's Supper and the Passover, and of course when they arrive, what would be typical is that there would be someone who would wash the feet of the guests who have come in. And of course, they realized no one had done this, and Jesus gets up, not just to teach them a lesson on servanthood, but to teach them a lesson about cleansing, about walking with clean hearts as saved people. Not one of those that were present there of the 12 was not clean because he had never been saved. He had never been bathed, to use the terminology. And so Jesus said he was bathed, only needs to have his feet washed. And so sometimes I'll say once bathed, always bathed, once saved, always saved. But as you walk through this life, you get your feet dirty. And so Jesus, after he teaches them a lesson on cleansing that he said they won't fully comprehend until later on, and Peter alludes to it in his first epistle, nonetheless, there is some truth that they can grasp that night. And he says, if I then, the Lord and the teacher, wash your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. Now, does that mean that when you come over to my house, I should wash your feet? That's what Jesus said here. He said we should wash one another's feet. No, when I put it in its historical, grammatical context, then I understand what is cultural and what is binding. What's binding is, one, to have a clean heart as I walk and serve the Lord. But what also is binding is that we serve one another. Because as we serve one another, we're serving the Lord. And of course, in that day, because they wore open sandals and you were typically either walking through unpaved, dusty roads or roads that were liquid mud. And so when you arrived at a person's home, though you might have taken a bath before you came for, say, some special event, your feet were still dirty and they needed to be washed. And so there's a timeless principle, and the timeless principle is that we serve one another. If I, the Lord and Master, did this for you, then what should you do? Truly, I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is the one who is sent greater than the one who sent you. So I start here because I think this local assembly would acknowledge that there are examples in the New Testament where there are cultural indexed expressions. And I think the same could be true and argued for head coverings. Now, again, it depends on where you live in the world. For instance, it is true in the first century that a head covering was a sign of submission to your husband's authority, not just in terms of believers, but also amongst unbelievers. So, for instance, when you went to Eastern Europe in the mid to late 90s, as communism fell and there were opportunities for Christians to go, and we went, I think, first in 97 to Ukraine, and I could look out at a congregation of 1,000 people where I was preaching, and I could tell you who the married women were and who the single women were. All the married women had head coverings on, and not the little doily that some might put on, say, as we experienced as Catholics growing up, but a full head covering. And that's really what's pictured here in the Greek New Testament. And so it was a sign and a symbol that you recognized that your husband was your head. And of course, because Christianity was the religion of the former Soviet Union until, communism arrived, and it didn't dissolve overnight, but many of the cultural expressions continued. Now, 25 years later, things have changed. They've become much more westernized, and the sense of the need for a head covering is less of an issue. Though when we went there with people from our church, for instance, my wife wore a head covering when we were in the assembly. Why? Because it was an issue of, while she was free not to wear one in the strictest sense, you're all things to all men that you might win some, and two, you don't want to do anything that would cause unnecessary offense that would cause your brother to stumble. But in the first century culture, the wearing of a veil or a head covering reflected a common societal norm, much like foot washing did. And so, but the timeless principle that is taught here in 1 Corinthians 11 is that a wife is under God's authority, and to be under God's authority, you're under your husband's authority. And that's really what you acknowledge at the marriage altar. He didn't take your name. You took his name because you recognized that there was a new head. And so I would say maybe in some parts of the world today, like still in parts of Eastern Europe, where you go into smaller villages and towns, and believers and unbelievers alike, if they're married, have head coverings, then I would say, yeah, there's a place for it. But it doesn't really carry that connotation in most 21st century places. And for the most part, it's almost dissolved and gone in the former Soviet Union. So it's not really an issue. I think to your own church's detriment, while on the one hand, they want to obey the Lord and follow Scripture, which I appreciate, but they need to stop and ask, have all these Bible scholars and Bible teachers like myself for the last, 500 plus years been in gross error in terms of the role of head coverings? I don't think so. I think we understand the passage in light of what it meant to the original audience. And that's what you always ask first whenever you interpret a passage of Scripture. What did it mean to the original audience? How would they have understood it? And so sometimes there's a cultural issue, but there's a timeless principle here that has never changed, and that is male headship in the church and in the family. And that's what's to be reflected. But I think it will be to your church's detriment, because unbelievers will come in, and now what you're doing is you're not really practicing a biblical norm that God has dictated, where you think, well, it doesn't matter what they think. But what you're practicing is a cultural norm that is not binding today, and you've created this oddity amongst yourself and your ability and your opportunity to reach lost people with the gospel. And that becomes sad, because you've created an unnecessary stumbling block to give the gospel of Christ to people that you might invite. And the assumption, by the way, in 1 Corinthians 11 through 14 is that there'll be unbelievers who will attend, because people will say, well, the worship service isn't for unbelievers. Well, no, it's primarily first and foremost for believers. But on the same hand, when Paul argues like why they shouldn't be speaking in uninterpreted tongues, but a clear, understandable word should be given, is because if someone comes in and they hear another foreign language that they don't know, and that someone is speaking it who, doesn't normally know that language, they'll think you're crazy. But if there's a clear, articulate word from the Lord, they're going to think otherwise, and they may fall down on their face and worship God. So in my view, it's created a problem. And so what would I do? If this is where the church leadership is gone, the place is not to become a point of division, but probably find another church. That would be my recommendation. they've come to this conclusion. They say the burden of proof is on you to prove otherwise. Okay, so I would prove otherwise through the last at least 500 years of church history, where in most places of the world this has not been an issue. Still was an issue, still can be an issue in some small, obscure places of the world where this cultural norm is still practiced. But for the most part, it's not an issue in the 21st century. And to make it an issue, you've created an oddity that is unnecessary and a stumbling block to reaching unsaved people with the gospel. Let's go to the next question.
Dr. Carl Broggi answers your questions about the Bible and living the Christian life Tuesday mornings at 11 on The Light 88.7 FM and online around the world at wagp.net.